on this Tuesday, June 8th, along with Joe, Willie, and me, we have former U.S. Senator, now on NBC News, and MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill. Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, joins us, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst Eugene Robinson joins us. Let's dive right in. A bipartisan Senate investigation of the January 6th Capitol insurrection released just this morning highlights the intelligence and personnel failures leading up to and during the attack. The report, conducted by both the Senate Rules Committee and Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, details how ill-equipped and underprepared the Capitol Police Force was while defending the building and the people inside it. For example, according to the report, of the 7 civil disturbance units deployed, only 4 had the protective equipment needed, some of which was locked in a bus. There's this line from the report, quote, "An officer reported hearing a lieutenant repeatedly ask over the radio, 'Does anybody have a plan?' The probe also found that neither the FBI nor DHS issued a threat assessment warning of potential violence targeting the Capitol that day, which is incredible, but there were severe limits to what the investigation could uncover. The committees say they were not provided with all the requested documents, including from the DOJ, DHS, and the House Sergeant-at-Arms. The report specifically does not address the root causes of the Capitol attack. The Senate committee also did not investigate former President Trump's actions that incited the insurrection. And what's frustrating about this, Joe, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts, is that this really focuses on the mechanics of that day. The last thing I want to do is really be focusing on the Capitol cops and their lack of preparedness. I want to know why they were and what led up to that and the reasons behind it, rather than focusing on the people who were attacked that day and were left completely exposed to a massive insurrection that killed people and tortured many, including Capitol cops.
Well, you see, that's why you and I are the Donnie and Marie of morning television, because you're a little bit of country and I'm a little bit of rock and roll. You want to know
where's this going?
Exactly why. You want to know the build-up. You want to know a lot of the bigger questions. Right now, my obsession is on the TikTok of this. What happened inside the Capitol? Why were the Capitol Hill leaders, the leaders of the Capitol Hill police force, so ill-prepared? What happened inside that Capitol? I think this is a good first piece of it. And yes,
sure,
as I said last hour, we can go around and we can put on sackcloth and ashes and we can wail night and day about what we did not get in this report. But I think there's a lot that we did get in this report that's a good starting point to ask some important questions. Like, for instance, Claire McCaskill, you served inside that building. I served inside that building. We went past Capitol Hill cops every day. They were wonderful. They did their jobs very well. I had nothing but good experiences from them. But it's very clear looking at this report that they were left high and dry by their leaders time and time again. There was intel that they got leading up to January the 6th that they did not act upon. They did not prepare for. And of course, the harrowing moment in the report where a police officer keeps yelling does anybody have a plan? And you keep hearing on the radio, does anybody have a plan? And their leaders weren't answering because their leaders didn't have a plan. And then finally, of course, all the different agencies, all the fact that everybody was stepping on everybody else and trying to figure out how to get reinforcements in there. I think there's a lot to look at here. And yes, I will agree, we need a bicameral commission. We don't have it right now. But we have enough facts right now to look at what went wrong. And I'm curious, looking at this report, what you're thinking.
Well, first, I think this is the opening act on what should be a bicameral, bipartisan select committee that is appointed by the leaders of Congress. Clearly, the Republicans are hiding under their desks and don't want this in the headlines anymore. It was a brazen political vote to deny this country the commission it deserves after seeing what we saw on January 6th. But I do think they have the power to move ahead with the committee. You know, what I think about the Capitol Police Department, Joe, is that they suffered from the same problem all of us suffered. I don't think they could imagine this kind of thing happening on the grounds of the United States Capitol. That lack of ability to actually plan for this kind of cataclysmic violent event on the grounds of the Capitol is really the indictment here. And what I want the guy in the quote-unquote intelligence department of the Capitol Police with his hand in the air, taking an oath in front of a committee and answering this question. When you got this intelligence from the FBI, tell us why you didn't do anything with it. That's what I want to hear.
And Willie, we need to take ourselves back to January the 5th and look at the environment of January the 5th. Maybe there was a lack of imagination. We heard about that before 9/11. There was a lack of imagination. Nobody could have imagined what was going to happen on that day. And perhaps the same thing is true with January the 6th. Maybe Capitol Hill leaders, Capitol Hill cops, and their leadership lacked imagination. But that's also something that was shared with a lot of not only leaders in Washington, D.C., but members of the media who had become incensed. And I'm sure we were among them. I'm sure I was among them. Became incensed that the National Guard troops rolled into Washington, D.C. During the Black Lives Matters protests. And we hear in this report, we read in this report, some of the members of the National Guard being reluctant to go back in to Washington, D.C. around a political, at that point it was a political riot. But at the same time, far different. I'm not equating the two. So everybody just take a deep breath. I'm just saying the bar was obviously set higher by the National Guard on when those troops started rolling because of what had happened 6-7 months ago and the criticism that they had gotten about Donald Trump trying to militarize Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's what we've heard even before this report came out early this morning, that there was a concern about showing a military force in the streets, except when we go back and just from open source reporting and media reporting, we know that the calls went out to the National Guard and there was a long lag time of several hours before they boarded those buses and actually came over to the Capitol. And Peter Baker, what we heard in the last couple of weeks from many Republicans who voted against the idea of a January 6th commission is that there are a bunch of investigations already going on in the Congress. Let's rely on those to get our information. The problem is, as this report lays out, though it does have a lot of really important information, is that they didn't get access to everything they needed access to. They didn't hear back from the Sergeant at Arms. Justice, Homeland Security didn't respond to a lot of the requests. This is not a fulsome report about what happened that day and what led up to that day, though it does detail part of it and may be a good start.
Well, I think that's right, Willie. You know, the advantage that the 9/11 Commission had was that basically everybody talked to them. Everybody felt the need to talk to them politically. They had to explain themselves. The 9/11 Commission had access to literally, I think, millions of pages worth of documents and papers that were, throughout the government. And this obviously does not have that kind of comprehensive approach. And I think that's the not failing of this report, but the fact that it doesn't actually complete the story leaves us wanting more. What did happen at the White House that day? What did happen, with the President of the United States at that day? When was he informed? What was he told? What did he order? What did he not order? What was, going on in the West Wing as they saw the images that were playing on our screen right now? Those questions, I think, are sort of paramount right now, in addition to the questions that this report tries to answer about the failures of the intelligence and the failures of imagination on the part of the Capitol Police.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, I just really quickly, we have just some news that's breaking that's very interesting considering how we opened the top of the show about possible ransomware. Major websites are experiencing outages, including the New York Times, CNN, and Amazon Web Services. Large parts of the internet went down early Tuesday with the UK government, Reddit, and others scrambling to get their websites back online. So, Mika, this
don't know what's going on, but
yeah,
a little bit concerning. We need to follow that because given different types of ways that countries can undermine each other, we have to now look at this as part of the landscape. But in terms of, we'll be following this, in terms of the conversation we've been having, this next New York Times report is somewhat connecting. It looks at the rising group of Republican candidates who are aggressively pushing Donald Trump's baseless claims that he was robbed of his re-election. The paper reports a Republican House candidate from Wisconsin says he is appalled by the violence he witnessed at the January 6th rally that turned into the siege at the Capitol, but he did not disagree with GOP lawmakers' efforts to overturn the presidential election results that night. In Michigan, a woman known as the MAGA bride, after photos of her Trump-themed wedding dress went viral, is running for Congress, while falsely claiming that it is highly probable the former president carried her state and won re-election. And in Washington state, the Republican nominee for governor last year is making a bid for Congress months after finally dropping a lawsuit challenging his 2020 defeat, a contest he lost by 545,000 votes. Let's bring in the co-author of the report, New York Times reporter Lisa Lehrer. She's the author of the New York Times newsletter on politics with Lisa Lehrer. And Lisa, this is the big lie going down the line in local and state elections. I mean, this is, to me, the continuation of Donald Trump, or the type of concepts based on lies and based on untruths and misinformation that is spreading across the country at the local level.
That's exactly right. And I think it shows us two things. First of all, how these conspiratorial views and these falsehoods pushed by the former president, things about, questioning the election, questioning President Biden's legitimacy as president, have really spread from sort of fringe ideas that nobody would have taken seriously into the mainstream of the Republican Party. Questioning the election has become an organizing principle for Republicans. More than 2/3, plus or minus, of Republicans have questions about the election. Their candidates are hearing about this constantly. They're echoing those questions. So this is not some fringe issue in the Republican Party. This is what these candidates are running on, particularly right now in primaries, and it's what a lot of Republican base voters and activists want to hear. It is a top concern for them.
Yeah, Gene Robinson, this is obviously very disturbing for a lot of people. It can go one of two ways, though. I always think back to what happened. The Tea Party emerged in 2010. In 2012, candidates tried to sort of out-Tea Party the Tea Partiers. Barack Obama was reelected, and things didn't go so great for the Republican Party. In 2014, they became even more extreme. A lot of the candidates became a little more extreme and whacked out. And at that point, I remember the United States Chamber of Commerce, the Koch brothers, a lot of people got involved with a special election in around Mobile, Alabama, with Bradley Byrne, who was sort of the Main Street Republican candidate back then. And they just said enough and got involved because they saw where this extremism was leading them, and that was to defeat. I suspect the Republican establishment is not there quite yet with a lot of these crazy candidates that are now talking about nullifying elections. But, there's no guarantee that this is a winning formula for a Republican Party that gave up the House, the Senate, and the White House last year.
Well, I think we should all hope it's a losing formula because this is so dangerous it undermining the foundation of American democracy, really, and the peaceful transfer of power, and the fact that we have close elections, but we accept the results, the verified, audited, recounted results of our elections, and we don't continue with the fiction and the fraud that an election was stolen. But it's, the Republican establishment, one wonders where it is, because the base is on fire with this stuff, and the base is sort of leading. The real crazy is bubbling up out in the states and sort of then filtering into Washington and into the centers of power. But those brush fires out there, no one is trying to tamp down, and I just find it really, really worrying if this habit becomes established that we don't accept an election because we lost it. If that becomes a habit, that's awful. That's awful for this country.
Yeah, can I ask you, Gene, we had Tom Nichols saying about an hour ago he's more concerned today than he actually was a year ago, which I really didn't think was possible for Tom or for a lot of people. I'm curious, are you more concerned today with the state, not of the Republican Party, but the state of American democracy than you were, say, a year ago? Because seeing that even after Donald Trump's defeat, we still have millions and millions of Americans and a chunk of the Republican Party that seems to be moving in an illiberal direction, in a very frightening direction.
Well, I was actually more concerned a year ago because I was concerned that Donald Trump could be, reelected president and we could have 4 more years of utter ruin, and who knows what would be left of American democracy after that. So that comparison aside, you have to be concerned when one of our 2 great political parties is in the state that the Republican Party is in right now, and when its base just believes in a reality that's not real, in alternative facts that are not facts, in this crazy version of recent history that simply is not true. Yet millions of people believe it and are having it reinforced, and that's just that you got to have a common sort of chronicle of events and encyclopedia of facts that we can then argue about. But we get further and further away from that, and I just worry about the Republican base and where it stands. This year, next year, the year after that. Does it come back to its sanity or not? I'm not sure it does.
And Lisa, of course, the big lie is much more than rhetoric. As Gene says, it's now the foundation of legislation in states across the country based around, quote, election integrity, securing the elections that we know were already secure. But I think it's important to underline for people who live in facts, for people who know the history of the court cases that took place over the last several months, that there is an entire parallel universe of media in which the big lie is truth. And that's the media that politicians are consuming and that they're feeding back to the people who they hope will vote for them, which is that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president and there was something fishy going on with the election last year.
Right. There's a whole alternative lab of information out there that's sort of feeding this stuff to people. I mean, I was talking to folks in Arizona who are involved with that partisan recount run by the Republican Party out there, and they were talking to me about bamboo in ballots, that there was bamboo in the paper and that meant something had come from China. I mean, there's no fact in that. This is in the realm of conspiracy theories. But just to Joe's point, I sort of wonder why the establishment cavalry is coming. It's been 6 months since the election. Right. There's been very few Republicans, very, very few, outliers really, who have been willing to stand up and say assertively that Joe Biden is the president of the United States and the election was fair and square. In fact, I think there's sort of 2 groups. There's the group who are bought into the lies and see this as something to rally their base around or really believe it. And then there's a second group who believes that if they can just sort of put their heads in the sand, all of this is kind of going to go away away. And by the time they get to the midterms, they can talk about the things the party wants to talk about, or the leaders of the party, like crime and inflation and are Biden's plans too expensive for the country. But I think after the past 6 years of President Trump, former President Trump, there's no reason to expect that will be possible. That's not a tactic that has worked for the Republican Party really much at all in the past several years. So I think the future in terms of Republicans standing up and putting down these lies about the election does not look particularly optimistic.
Yeah. So Lisa, forgive me. I'm gonna break the Perry Mason rule. I'm gonna ask you a question I don't know the answer to, and I don't know if you know the answer to it. So I apologize if I don't mean to blindside you here. In 2014, that 2014 model I showed, the base was still red hot, and they were red hot Tea Partiers. But it was sort of this selection process that the people that funded the campaigns, and I know they're funded differently now, more grassroots than back then, but the people who funded the campaign, the leaders like Mitch McConnell and then I guess John Boehner, who they helped get through the primary process, who they supported, who they didn't support. Do you know at this stage, are Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, are either one of them sorting through these candidates, trying to find the more mainstream candidate and sort of push them forward like the Republican Party did in 2014?
I think there are groups and there are people in the Republican Party trying to do that. But I think that, as you point out, the power structure of these parties has changed. A viral moment can raise more money for these candidates than anything, the party could have done to help them. And you have to remember, of course, that the Republican base hates Mitch McConnell as much as they hate some Democrats, practically, right? He's not someone, and him being involved in some of these primaries would hurt those candidates. But I do think there's a larger question here that a lot of the Republicans that you're talking about are worried about, which is how, a candidate who embraces these lies about the election, how do they pivot back if they do make it through a primary in the general election, and particularly in those kind of key swing suburban districts that Republicans need to win control of the House? Can they make themselves marketable in a general election to the kinds of independent voters that they need to win in those places and therefore win back control of Congress? And it is a real question. One test case for this is happening now in Virginia, where we see the governor's race and the Republican candidate. They're trying to make this very pivot. Virginia, of course, has become pretty Democratic in the past couple cycles, so it's not the easiest place to do it. But, that's a place to watch if you want to see how some candidates may try to, should they make it through the primary, may try to pull off this political switcheroo. But it's not going to be easy.
Right. It'll be a lot harder to pull off the political switcheroo in governor's races and in statewide Senate races than in very gerrymandered House races, obviously. Lisa, thank you so much for being with us. We greatly appreciate your reporting. Peter Baker, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about an interesting decision by the Justice Department to continue representing Donald Trump as former president of the United States in the defamation suit from Ms. Carroll. Any insights on why they are doing that, especially after Joe Biden correctly said last year that the Justice Department is not a band of personal attorneys for the sitting president?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So this is the case of Jean Carroll, who accused the president of raping her years ago. He obviously pushed back against that and demeaned her in a way that she filed a defamation lawsuit against him. And the Justice Department, of all institutions, took up the cause in order to defend Donald Trump. Now, a lot of people thought at that time that suggested that the Justice Department was becoming sort of a personal tool of the president rather than a representative of American national interests. What this Justice Department is saying under Merrick Garland, under President Biden, is that no, there's a principle to be upheld here about lawsuits against government officials in their capacity as government officials, including the President of the United States, and that they were going to go ahead and pursue that principle, even under the unsavory elements of this particular case, and a defendant in Donald Trump that they don't particularly like. So I think that's interesting, and it tells us a little bit about Merrick Garland and how he's approaching these issues at the Justice Department, trying not to look at them simply as okay, the last guys did it, so therefore it must be wrong, trying to approach it from his own view of what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. And remember, one thing we learned over the years is when you're in the executive branch, when you're in the White House, whether you're Democrat or president, there are some things that look the same regardless of party. And one thing about that is executive power. You hear a lot of candidates on the outside when they're running for office against an incumbent president saying, well, they've abused executive power. And then once they get in there, they tend to look at it the way other people do from that position. So where you sit is where you stand in Washington is where you sit.
Exactly. This is where Joe Biden stood during the presidential campaign as a candidate when the question was brought up about Ms. Carroll's lawsuit.
News that Joe mentioned last block, hundreds of the world's most popular websites went down earlier this morning following an outage at a major internet service supporting company by the name of Fastly. Problems at that company knocked sites offline, including Amazon, the New York Times, and those of the British government. Fastly states that the issue has been identified and a fix is being implemented. The cause is currently unclear, but we're going to be following this story as it develops.
Yeah. And you
Joe,
know,
that's just potentially a really big story.
Well, it really is, and it explains. A lot of people don't understand, Willie, why Morning Joe has, instead of a website, we sort of do a ticker tape, and you can set up a ticker tape machine in your room, and you can read the ticker tape for any breaking Morning Joe news. But the thing is, you look at the consolidation. Everybody's using the same cloud. Everybody's using the same this. Everybody's using the same that. It is so dangerous. You just hack into one cloud, and suddenly you've got everybody from the British government to businesses across the world, and media outlets across the world that are crippled.
Yeah, and the ease with which it can be done is kind of staggering, whether it's a newspaper's website or a pipeline that feeds the entire East Coast, it's oil and gas. I started the morning on the New York Times website, went to look at it about 10 minutes later, and it was down. I figured it was something with our internet service, but they have a number of sites have been targeted here this morning, and we'll probably learn more over the course of the day. But we talked earlier about the New York City Law Department yesterday. You talked about even something like the Steamship Authority in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. It's just too easy to get into these systems, and as we've talked about a lot over the last couple of weeks, experts tell us this is the new war. You don't have to lob missiles into the United States to cripple the country. You can do it with a couple of hackers sitting in Russia.
And now doing it to the Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard ferries? My God, the humanity.
Have you no shame?
Okay.
Have you no shame? Again, Meacham, and Henry Cabot Lodge. What did they say, Willie? An attack against one wasp is an attack against the entirety of the Anglican Church.
The Meacham
This shall not stand. So I will say, when we are talking, when we talk about consolidation of technology, and regardless of what legislation ultimately passes on election laws, Mika, it is critical that people understand we don't want things consolidated for American elections. I take great comfort in the fact that, like, for instance, in the state of Florida, there's 67 counties, there's 67 supervisors of elections, and there's 67 different systems if they so choose to have those 67 different systems. One of the reasons why our elections would be so hard to hack, impossible to hack on a national level, is because they are decentralized. So whatever plans are passed, that is true. And people say, oh, we want all the systems, but no, you don't want all the systems, even in the same state put together. You want there to be individual systems. You want them to all be safe. They all have to meet a certain threshold. But it is the decentralization of American democracy that protects it from China or North Korea or Iran or Russia being able to hack an entire system with a couple of strokes of the keyboard.
Well, this could be the next frontier because everybody is connected on some very, very focused systems on our phones. I just say it could be the next frontier in terms of shutting down communication, which would be horrific. We can talk more about this, but for now, tomorrow, President Biden leaves on his first foreign trip as Commander-in-Chief. He will attend next week's NATO summit, where he will have the chance to reset America's relationship with the organization after 4 years of former President Trump's combative stance against NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg previewed that renewed relationship with a trip to the White House yesterday. And Secretary Jens Stoltenberg joins us now. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you on the show. We want to hear what the goals are for strengthening the alliance, perhaps looking forward more than looking back in terms of America's relationship within the alliance.
We have now a unique opportunity to open a new chapter in the transatlantic bond, the bond between North America and Europe in NATO. And I had a very good meeting with President Biden yesterday, and he knows NATO very well. He knows Europe. I have worked with him in his previous capacities, and I'm really looking forward to welcoming him to Brussels to the NATO summit. And at that summit, we will agree an ambitious, forward-looking agenda, NATO 2030, which is about how to adapt NATO to the future in an age of global competition. We need to stand together in North America and Europe.
Mr. Secretary General, Joe Biden's talking about the importance of promoting democracy across Europe, across the world. How much of a challenge has been the rise of self-described illiberal democracies like Hungary, and also obviously a concern in Poland as well over the past 4 years? How important is that, and do you sense that tide can be turned with the United States being more active in NATO, more active in Europe?
So we are 30 different nations in NATO from both sides of the Atlantic, and of course, and with different political parties in power. And of course, there are differences. But first of all, we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other. This is good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States to have a strong NATO. No other major power has 29 friends and allies as the United States has in NATO, and that's not least important in the light of the challenges China poses to all of us. So that's the importance of NATO. Then, of course, there are differences, and I strongly believe that NATO is a platform to address those differences, to sit down and share our views and also our concerns. I have done that myself on issues like democracy, rule of law, because these are core values for NATO, and NATO is a platform also to address differences when we have them.
Yes, sir. Gene Robinson is with us and has a question for you. Gene.
Yeah, Mr. Stoltenberg, good to speak with you. You mentioned China and the challenge it poses. I wonder if you would also talk about Russia and the forces that are on the border with Ukraine, the continued occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. How going forward? I mean, this is the sort of the traditional posture of NATO is with a very wary eye toward Russia. But how should NATO look at this relationship in the near future?
We have to follow up on what we have called or defined as a dual-track approach to Russia. We need to be strong, we need to be firm, but at the same time we need to talk to Russia. Because we have seen a pattern of aggressive behavior where Russia has invested heavily in new military capabilities, and not only that, but have used military power against or force against neighbors like Georgia and Ukraine. And of course we have to react, and we have to be very firm when we see those kind of aggressive action. At the same time, we need to talk to them because Russia is our neighbor, and we need to strive for a better relationship. But even without a better relationship with Russia, we need to manage a difficult relationship with Russia, meaning to sit down and talk on issues like arms control, risk reduction, transparency on military activities along our borders, to prevent any incidents or accidents. And therefore, one of the issues I discussed with President Biden yesterday was arms control. NATO allies welcomed the U.S. decision to extend the New START treaty, limiting the number of long-range nuclear weapon systems. But we need to go further, include more weapon systems and also new technologies. And at some stage, we also need to include China in global arms control. So yes, the aggressive behavior of Russia is of great concern. We need to be strong, but also sit down and talk to them.
Mr. Secretary General, you were at the White House yesterday meeting with President Biden. I'm curious to know how different an experience that was than sitting down or negotiating with President Trump, who looked at the American relationship with NATO as a financial transaction, thought we were paying too much, and you were in the position of having to negotiate down how much the U.S. put in. How different is the approach of this administration to NATO than the previous?
Of course, they are two different presidents. At the same time, it is important for me as Secretary General to be able to work with the United States, because the United States is the biggest NATO ally, and that was also the case for me over the previous 4 years. Having said that, I think that it has been a very consistent message from the United States over several different administrations, the need for what we call more or fairer burden sharing in NATO, meaning that European allies and Canada have to invest more. That was actually a decision we made together in 2014 under the Obama administration when Biden was vice president. And since 2014, our summit, we made that decision, all allies have invested more. And across Europe and Canada, they have added 260 billion extra US dollars over this period for defense. 7 consecutive years of increases. So we still have a way to go, but the good news is that the European allies and Canada are stepping up, and that Europe and North America are doing more together in NATO now than we have done for many years, with higher readiness, with combat-ready battle groups and eastern part of the alliance, and one of them also led by the United States. So this demonstrates transatlantic unity in praxis by fair burden sharing and more NATO activities.
Yeah. Mr. Secretary General, last week we had America's former National Security Advisor John Bolton on, who was talking about the Russian threat, Russian expansion, talking about what happened in Georgia in 2008, what happened in Ukraine in 2014. And he believed the United States needed to work with NATO to expand NATO membership in certain areas. Do you believe that NATO, expanding NATO, would be a good way to check Russian aggression in the future?
So NATO has expanded, including recently. Just over the last few years, we have added in 2 more members: North Macedonia just a year ago, and Montenegro 3 years ago. So NATO's door remains open, and we have demonstrated that by inviting in 2 new members. And if you look at the broader picture, actually one of the biggest success stories of our alliance is the enlargement. At the end of the Cold War, there were 16 members of NATO. Today we have almost doubled that number to 30. And the enlargement of NATO has been extremely important to spread democracy, freedom across Europe. We have some countries which are inspiring for NATO membership. Ukraine, Georgia, we are working with them. We have told them that they should focus on reform to meet the NATO standards, to fight corruption. And we help them, we support them. And first of all, that's important in itself. It makes them stronger and more resilient societies by investing in reform. And second, it moves them gradually towards membership.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. We really appreciate it. And